G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I'd like to do a little bit of a review and analysis of the missing Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777, which took off about a week ago from Kuala Lumpur and departed towards Peking, or Beijing as it's called these days. And after it had been flying for about an hour on an 8-hour flight, the aircraft made a radio transmission to the Malaysian Air Traffic Control and notified them that it was entering Vietnamese airspace. This is approximately where that radio transmission was made from. As soon as that happened, the aircraft disappeared from Malaysian Air Traffic Control radar. By Sunday morning, experts were speculating all around the world on all the various factors that have been known to cause airliners to crash without making a distress call on the radio. And we were all told the thing to do is wait until they locate the debris and examine the black box flight recorders and instrument records, and that will tell us what caused it. And we were more or less told to keep our hair on and not get excited at the idea of terrorism, because there are lots of things that can cause aircraft to crash. But almost at the same time, rumours began to circulate that 2 people on the passenger list had got onto the aircraft with stolen passports. So there was a bit of a flurry at the possibility that maybe stolen passports were being used by terrorists. However, in my mind, the world champion experts at stolen passports and terrorism would have to be Mossad. Now, why would the Israeli secret intelligence, who normally steal Australian and New Zealand passports so they can run around Dubai and kill Jordanians they don't like, why would they target a Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 heading for Beijing? Didn't make much sense. So it wasn't totally surprising when we learnt that the people with the stolen passports were actually Iranians attempting to enter Europe as illegal economic refugees. However, the search centred on the South China Sea initially, but they couldn't find anything there. And then the Malaysian military announced that they had spotted an aircraft without its transponder switched on, and a transponder is a gadget in the cockpit which magnifies and amplifies the aircraft's radar return, and it encrypts information into the aircraft's amplified radar return, so that instead of just a dot on the radar in the control tower, the air traffic controller sees a dot with a circle around it, sometimes a rectangle, and a string of letters to identify the flight. Switch the transponder off and you're only going to get a very faint dot. So military radar is generally better than civilian radar, and according to the Malaysian military, they tracked an aircraft departing this position from altitude, losing height as fast as it could, flying west, and they lost sight of it over the Straits of Malacca, and they said that it was headed west in the direction of India when they last saw it. Well, that's an interesting idea. And the Malaysians commenced a secondary search operation in the Straits of Malacca looking for the wreckage. They couldn't find it. Next thing we heard was that the Chinese had decided Malaysia wasn't trying hard enough, because there are 120 odd Chinese on the aircraft, and the Chinese said that they had spotted via satellite some kind of debris in the South China Sea, pretty close to the flight plan track of the aircraft and not too far away from where the last radio voice transmission was made. Trouble is, when people went out there and had a look with a boat, they couldn't find anything. And that doesn't really surprise me, because the Chinese satellite photographed something 24 metres long and 19 metres wide, and there's no part of an airliner that has those measurements. So I suspect they were photographing the light reflections off a floating raft of seaweed, perhaps a mat of foam bubbles, something like that. It wasn't an aeroplane. And so there was more argy-bargy among the politicians, and the Malaysians came in for a bit of stick for losing an aeroplane, and some people have started talking about the size of the lawsuit that Malaysian Airlines might be facing from the distraught relatives of those who were on board. But then, yesterday afternoon, and I'm making this movie at nearly 11 o'clock on a Friday night, so Thursday afternoon Australian time, ABC Radio National announced that the Wall Street Journal had printed a story claiming that they had two separate sources of information to the effect that the aircraft had continued flying for a period of 4 hours after its last known position, its last radio report and its last radar identification by the civilian air traffic control radar. Now, 4 hours is a long time to be missing. And immediately the Malaysian government began to attempt to debunk those claims. So let's see, where could a Boeing 777 with enough fuel for Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, where could it go in 4 hours if it diverted 1 hour into the flight? I'm afraid we're going to have to employ a little bit of high-tech flight plan computering. If we figure on minus 12 degrees centigrade at 30,000 feet. Consider the wind, speed and direction. And we factor in a cruising speed of about 350 miles per hour. Now they said it was an 8-hour flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, so that's 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, and we're up there on the 8 hours to Beijing, although this old map shows it as peaking. So that's how far the aircraft could have gone if it stayed at 30,000 feet for fuel economy. However, 1, 2, 3, 4 hours away from the point of departure from the planned flight track would take them to the Philippines, or about half of Indonesia, or round about to Hainan. So, what about this idea that the Malaysian military has a trace of an aircraft departing this position, losing height, flying across almost the narrowest and least populated part of the Malaysian peninsula and setting off in the direction of India? Well, despite the debunking attempts, this morning a couple of words were added to the report. It said that the Wall Street Journal was claiming it had two sources of information to the effect that there were mechanical traces, that the engines had continued to operate for 4 hours and the aircraft had continued to fly, and the traces were picked up by Rolls-Royce in England and by Boeing in Seattle. So here we have the point of departure from the flight plan, and we see the Malaysian peninsula, and we have a little bit of a look at the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea. And well, first thing that comes to mind is that there are actually some islands there. This lower set are the Nicobar Islands, owned by India, and this higher set are the Andaman Islands, owned by India, and there's also the Mk archipelago in about there. And how would Boeing in Seattle and Rolls-Royce in England know that the aircraft had continued to fly for 4 hours after it went off the radar and made its last radio transmission? Well, you see, about 5 years ago, the Rolls-Royce company decided that instead of selling jet engines to airlines who may be having trouble finding the money to maintain them properly, and if they don't get maintained properly they might fail, and if a Rolls-Royce engine failed that might reflect badly on Rolls-Royce and that could be bad for business. So Rolls-Royce decided not to sell engines. They decided to lease a power package. They sell airlines a contract to provide jet thrust on a per minute basis. The engine remains the property of Rolls-Royce. The airline pays for an engine that is operating, and it has to go back to Rolls-Royce for maintenance on a regular schedule. Once upon a time there would have been a danger of the operator flying the aircraft 5 times and only writing down 4 takeoffs and 4 landings and saving a little bit of money that way. So what Boeing did was they put sensors into the engine and equipped the engine with its own telemetry package. So anywhere in the world, if somebody starts a Rolls-Royce power package, the engine sends a signal to a satellite, which sends a signal back to Rolls-Royce House in England, which says serial number da-di-da-di-da-di-da has started up at such and such a time, Zulu. Zulu being smart-ass talk for Greenwich Mean Time. And then every couple of minutes, maybe every 5 minutes during its operation, the engine lets Rolls-Royce headquarters know oil pressure, fuel flow, RPM, tailpipe temperature and throttle setting. And then it tells them when it's been shut down. So every minute of operation is accounted for and the airline gets to pay for it. So that's how come Rolls-Royce in England is pretty sure that the aircraft continued to fly for another 4 hours. Likewise, Boeing in Seattle can't always find customers who can afford to buy their airframes, even without the engines. So sometimes they lease the aircraft. Similar thing happens. You've got to know exactly how many minutes the aircraft has been operating or the whole contract doesn't make money. Therefore they put strain gauges in the wings and they put telemetry on them, and they also put sensors on the undercarriage down locks and the undercarriage operation system. So pilot starts the engine tells headquarters in England, I've been started. Aircraft commences to roar down the runway, the wings commence to lift, and the strain gauge telemeters that information back to Boeing in Seattle and says, this aircraft is taking off. Pilot selects wheels up, and the downlocks tell Boeing, we've just retracted the undercarriage. Aircraft flies off, continues telemetering its information, both to Boeing and to Rolls-Royce, and then 4 hours after its transponder was switched off and it apparently dived across the Malaysian peninsula and took off westward, the engines telemetered back to Boeing, the engines telemetered to Rolls-Royce and the airframe telemetered back to Boeing, oh, we've landed, and the engines have been switched off. So where does 4 hours from the point of departure from the flight plan get us? Well, if they'd stayed at 30,000 feet cruising altitude, they could have gone all the way to Sri Lanka, and I'm sure the rebel tigers of Tamil Elam, who once upon a time had a plan for a tiny little home-built air force, they would have liked the Boeing 777. You could even go all the way out here to the Lakshadweep Islands, which are off the west coast of the southern end of India. But they didn't stay at 30,000 feet, did they? They were right down at sea level, where the air's really thick and there's lots of oxygen in it, and the thicker the air, the more fuel the jet burns. So they didn't have 8 hours flying. And if we put our dividers here, we get 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours gets us just past the Nicobar Islands, and 4 hours gets us north up to the Andaman Islands. So, if they only went 3.5 hours and then turned north, they could have gone well past the Andaman Islands. But my best guess is that whoever pirated, stole the Boeing 777 has flown across here, got as far out away from the radar as possible, and then come up here and landed somewhere in the Andaman Islands. Now what they've done there is anybody's guess. My guess is they will have disabled the telemetry equipment, they will have refueled the aircraft, and it will have taken off and gone to parts unknown, for reasons unknown. And that's why yesterday afternoon the first ABC radio report mentioned that several security organisations held grave fears as to what the aircraft was likely to do next. Right? I mean, can you imagine Tony Abbott's reaction if somebody showed up with a Boeing 777 full of illegal refugee, asylum-seeking immigrant wannabes? He couldn't put them at Manus Island and call them boat people, could he? So maybe it's for people smuggling. Maybe it's for drug smuggling. Maybe it's for gun running. A lot of gun running goes on in this part of the world. Or, of course, somebody might want to strap a bag of fertiliser into each seat in the cabin and pour diesel oil into the fertiliser bags and then go and carry out a kamikaze suicide dive bombing attack on somebody that they think is politically unacceptable. And there's a few people in this part of the world who hold strong political beliefs on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. But the most interesting information came out this afternoon, which is that the United States Navy has dispatched warships to the Andaman Sea. So it's not just me who thinks that that's where it went. That's where the United States Navy is looking for it. Which is all very sad for the 120 Chinese who are on it, including a whole lot of high-profile musicians. It's all very sad for everybody else who was on it. And it's incredibly sad for their relatives. It's bad for the airline industry. It's pretty tragic for the security industry. And it's a source of endless curiosity as to where this Boeing 777 is going to turn up next. Because that is going to be anybody's guess unless you're in the loop and you know. And I'm not in the loop and I don't know. And as clever as my flight plan calculator is, it's not going to tell me what the next event will be in the history of the missing Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777. Not even me dividers can tell me that. But I reckon it's going to be an interesting development. Watch this space. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. And if you're in the Andaman Sea, go and have a look on the islands and maybe you'll be able to find the tyre marks somewhere. But I doubt the aircraft is still where it made its first landing and shut down so that they could disable the telemetry equipment. Just a guess. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.